Until now, we've been discussing motivation of the individual and how the individual works in a group environment. Now we're going to move to group behavior, because functioning in a group is, just as important as functioning as an individual. Motivating a group and getting a cohesive group is just as important as motivating the individual, because a lot of what we do in the employment world, in the business world in general, is based on groups. Now, a group, of course, is just two or more people working in an environment. It could be formal, which means it's established by the organization, or it could be informal, which means it is just two people who happen to be working on something similar, and they collaborate with each other, or five people, or 10 people. They're often established in a reaction to a need for some sort of social interaction, or they form naturally. And of course, informal groups can also have a significant effect on behavior and performance, things like that. In terms of how group forms, these are kind of the stages of the quote unquote five-stage model. The pre-stage is when there is no group. Stage one is when the group is actually forming. Stage two is this brainstorming idea. It's called storming over here in the slide because it is simply rhymes, probably because it rhymes with forming. But brainstorming is okay, establishing the norms of the organization, establishing the norms of the group, establishing the procedures, establishing the day-to-day operations. Then you have the norming, which everything kind of crystallizes into a form, and the group gets used to working together on whatever establishment procedure. And then they actually have to do whatever they were established for. If they were established to study something, or to increase the company's business on a particular area, they've got to perform. And then when the group is over and the group is no longer useful, it adjourns, which means it no longer really exists. It can be reformed, or something doesn't have to adjourn right away. It could be formed as a permanent group, or as a committee, or as something that works for a couple of years. In which case, it's performing for a couple of years after it gets to that point where, after it's already normed to the point where it has a group identity. Uh, Grouping, how a group works in terms of time, in terms of chronological sequence, can be based on phases. Those really are the five phases we just discussed: forming, storming, norming, performing, and finally adjourning. But in terms of the cohesion, in terms of the makeup of the group and how it looks, it's based on this idea of punctuated equilibrium, which is a concept that was borrowed from evolutionary biology. But it's based on this idea that things in the group are pretty constant until they accomplish one of those five stages. Now the group has normed, and now its cohesiveness and its functioning is much different than it was before it did. That's this idea: they first start, and then they get to the point where they're actually brainstorming in order to figure out how the group is going to operate, and that makes a massive change in the group. That makes a massive change in the functioning of how it works. Now let's look at some properties of groups. Our first is the role of the group and the role of the individuals within the group. A role is a set of expected behavior patterns, which means what is expected in terms of how each individual is going to behave and what the entire group is going to accomplish. Some of the subcategories in terms of a role or role perception, in other words, what do people think their roles are, and what do people think the role of the entire group is? That's going to be critical in ensuring that everybody's able to do their job, everybody understands their correct role, and everybody understands the role of the entire group. If some people think the group is there to make better marketing decisions, and another person thinks that the group is there to increase sales, and another group thinks that the group is there to make management decisions, well, then there's going to be a lot of cross purposes and tension, and people aren't going to agree on how to work. I mean, this happens in military contexts where different generals working on the same campaign think that there are different goals. One person thinks that the goal is to capture that city, and one person thinks the goal is to secure that pass, and generals keep on acting on their own in different ways, and it ends up causing major problems. If you study a little bit about the world wars and various other wars, you can see how this has really caused some major problems. So there needs to be consistency in role perception and in role expectations. In other words, how you think that your group and other people within your group are going to react in particular scenarios, and role conflict, which is natural. You have people conflicting or competing for the same roles. Then you have the concept of norms. Norms, notice these are kind of similar to the stages that we looked at before. Norms are what each party is expected to accomplish and what each party is expected to behave, and in a way that fits within the structure of the organization and within the structure of the group. Now, there are all sorts of important Sorry about that. There are all sorts of important aspects of norms. There are performance norms, in other words, the level of performance that each person is expected of. There are appearance norms. That could be both in physical appearance and in terms of how presentations are put together. Are people expected to write memoranda or create PowerPoints to explain to everybody else in the group or the rest of the company what their progress is and how they've been operating? Social arrangement norms, even. What role does each person play in terms of the relationships among the group? Who's the supervisor? Who's the person that's like, kind of keeps the morale up? Who's the person that keeps other people in the outside part of the company informed? And resource allocations. Committees, groups may have a certain amount of money that they have to spend on a project, and making sure that everybody understands what their limitations are in terms of resources is a very critical component of working as a group. Next in our discussion of group is a discussion of norms. In other words, how does the behavior of the members of a group conform to the best overall interests of the group and their productivity? The Hawthorne studies, which led to a doctrine called the Hawthorne effect, was a very interesting experiment. This is way back in, I think, the 1950s, or actually 19. There were a series of experiments. One was in the 1920s through the 1932, and eventually they were repeated a few times a little bit later on. But basically, long story short, the Hawthorne effect indicated that people actually behave better when they perceive that they're more productive when they perceive that they're being watched. Even something like increasing the lighting in a particular area actually increase productivity, even though people didn't necessarily see anybody staring at them and they didn't know whether the boss was watching. Just increasing the lighting in a warehouse, for example, causes people to work faster and work harder because they perceive that other people are able to see them. Where if they're working in a dark corner and they have kind of the sense of security that nobody could be watching them, they don't work as hard. So productivity actually increased because they were paid attention to by observers. People just now the lighting was part of that. The lighting is part of that because of the fact that people perceive that they're able to be viewed more when there's light than when there's not light. But being observed actually caused people to be more productive, even if the observers were just experimenters, even if the observers were strangers, not necessarily people that had control over them or power over them. Workers don't necessarily maximize individual rewards, economic rewards. In other words, people build and work together as a team because they want to work for the team, at least to some extent, not solely because they think they'll be economically rewarded. And the idea is that group standards are set and enforced by the group itself to the point where the group morale, and hey, since teachers were high school teachers will often tell you this, that you have to have, in order to have a successful year, one of the things you really need is a good class. If you have a class that's very sulky and has a bad attitude, well, then the people will feed off each other. And it'll just get worse as the cycle of sulkiness continues. And conformity is the idea of where people try to conform to the behavior of the expectations and the rest of the group. And these are the ideas that people become aware of what other members do, and if the other members conform to the system, then each individual will be more likely individually to conform to the system. The Ash studies, which are referenced over here, were a series of also very interesting studies where they measured the effect of conformity on people's actions. Basically, they took somebody who would normally give a right answer to a fairly obvious question, to a fairly easiest question, basically measuring two lines on a piece of paper where the answer was fairly obvious, and they had a group, and the group gave the wrong answer, and they wanted to see if the person would still give the right answer, and the answer was very often not. Very often the person would capitulate to the group, especially when there was nobody else in the group on his side, and to the point where, and the reason for this is because people naturally want to conform, and that's part of the idea of how a group works. People naturally want to conform. I mean, there's kind of a more sinister idea of the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment being where people were actually driven by authority to do things that are really bad. And you know, actually, let me show you both videos over here because I think they're useful. So I'm gonna put the Ash video on for you to watch based on that. Maybe a little bit later on we'll look at the Milgram study as well.
Okay, I want to give you a test of your visual acuity, your sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is, tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to agree with, to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2,
2.
2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Asch gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2. 1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
Now, one thing you may notice from the Ash video is this idea that people are likely to be conformants, and they want to do the things that are expected out of them from the group. But there's also deviancy. Deviancy, this idea of deviant workplace behavior, which I guess theoretically could be a positive if the group is doing something the wrong way, but also more often is a negative because people are not working towards the same goal as the rest of their group, which is a problem. And so the general idea for organizational behavior is to try to minimize the amount of deviant workplace behavior there is. Deviancy is likely to flourish when it's supported by group norms and there are people in the groups. Basically, the idea that there are people that support deviancy, and the idea of deviancy is something that is not considered a negative by the members of the group. People are more individualist. That's the situation where you have to watch out for deviancy a little bit more. There are some examples of deviancy. Now, these are generally negative issues. Obviously, there could be some positive issues that are deviants if the group is doing something bad, but here are some examples of things that could hurt a group's productivity based on deviancy. What can hurt production? Leaving early, working slowly, wasting resources, hurting the property belonging to the company. You can do by lying about the hours worked, which are obviously decreasing the productivity, stealing, sabotage. There could be political deviancy where people don't have the best interests of the group at heart. They really have the best interests of themselves at heart when they show favoritism, spreading rumors, blaming coworkers, and there's even personal aggression that could be involved as well when you're talking about deviancy in the workplace. The third group property I want to look at is status. And status, which is a position that's established in the social order. It could be social, which means outside of the workplace in, a family status, things like that. Or it could be in the workplace. You're the boss, you're the manager, you're the middle manager. I remember when AT&T, again another story from AT&T management from when my father worked there, there were 8 levels of management. So you could be a level 1 or a level 2, all the way up to, I guess the CEO was level 8. So that's a rigidly defined status. Today companies aren't quite that rigid because the companies are a little smaller and things are a little bit less formal than they were back then. But still, status is determined by the power that the person yields and the person's ability to contribute, and of course the person's individual characteristic is the person a good leader, and can the person encourage other people or stimulate other people to do the bidding of the organization. Of course, status has a tremendous impact on the group, and status has a tremendous impact on aspects of the work environment and how a person works within the group. High status members usually have freedom to deviate, and somebody who's on the lower level, who isn't the manager, who's on the assembly line, usually doesn't have a lot of discretion in terms of what they do. Whereas high status people who are managers, people who run the company, they are more assertive. They have more decision-making authority, and one of the things that you want to do in a group as much as possible is you want to kind of level the playing field a little bit if you want the productivity and ability of each person to shine. The more rigidity you have from the upper level managers, if you have a committee and you have the CEO is on the committee and an assembly line worker is on the committee or a customer service rep is on the committee, it's not really going to work so well because the customer service rep is not really going to challenge the CEO, and you're not going to have a lot of creativity going on over there, whereas groups that have members who are closer together in the organizational hierarchy have a greater chance of thinking outside the box. And then we have the idea of size. Smaller groups are faster because you don't have to debate things so much. And remember, you have 10 people on a committee, 12 people on a committee, one person disagrees, and that can cause a lot of extra conversation and a lot of waste of time. But on the other hand, large groups are consistently better at problem solving because you have the diversity of opinions and you have the diversity of views. So when you have a committee as opposed to one person, or a larger committee as opposed to a smaller committee, you're sacrificing efficiently, you're sacrificing time, but on the other hand, you're adding creativity and you're adding diversity to the group. It makes it a little bit easier for them to function. You have also this idea of social loafing, which is the tendency for individuals to expend less effort when they're working collectively than when they're working alone. That's the idea that people who you're working with a lot of other people, you don't feel as responsible. You have to finish a project by yourself, then you got to do it, or it isn't going to get done. Even in a small group, you figure if you're not going to work on it, you're not going to work hard, it's not going to get done. But when you're talking about a large group, well, then you figure maybe the other people will do it. You don't have to rely on yourself as much. That's why big companies, they have a diversity and they have the creativity and they have all those things. But on the other hand, they have to watch out for certain things where there are these large meetings. And again, I personally haven't worked for large corporations, but both my parents and a lot of people I know have worked for big corporations, and they say there's a lot of time wasted in meetings where people have these big meetings with 20 people in it, and 12 of them don't really need to be there and they aren't really contributing, and they're just there because they're there, and it doesn't really help that much because you have people who just are there because they're part of the group but may not be critical. Now that's part of the thing you're sacrificing when you're making large committees and large groups. There are causes of social loafing, of leaving things to everybody, or unequal distribution of work. People feel that people are just not given as much work, or diversion of responsibility, where some people are given more responsibility than others, and the ones that are not given responsibility feel that they don't have to work that hard, or whatever they do is not going to contribute that much to the success or failure of the project. Some of the things you can do to try to prevent social loafing is to set goals that are specific and that people know that they have to work towards. Increase intergroup competition. In other words, you have 3 or 4 groups in the same company who are all trying to sell. Well, maybe have some kind of a contest. Which group can sell the best? That motivates the members of the individual group, kind of like a team. Engage in peer evaluation, have people within the group kind of give feedback to each other in terms of how they're doing. Select members who have high motivation to work in groups in the first place. And of course, you can distribute rewards based on individual contributions, not just success or failure of the group. Cohesiveness, another very important group property, is the degree to which members are attracted to each other and motivated to stay in the group. In other words, how much do people care for the team? You have this when you're talking about a sports team. There has to be cohesiveness. If the people hate each other's guts, well, I guess theoretically they can still perform, but it's going to be much harder. It's going to be much easier to to have a team work for the team's goal if they like each other, especially when you're talking about more team sports. With baseball, it's a little different. People really behave individually, and their statistics are really individual. Whereas a sport like hockey, people have to be very cohesive and work together, and that's true with companies as well. Sometimes, if you're a sales force and people are making their individual sales, cohesiveness is a little less important. On the other hand, if it's a marketing team where everybody has to work together to come up with a message, then cohesiveness is very important. So, encouraging cohesiveness becomes very important when you're talking about establishing an effective group, making smaller groups, and having everybody in the group agree with the group goals can encourage cohesiveness. The bigger the group, the more likely there is to be falling out with each other or disagreements. Increase the time spent together, even if it's not during work. Sometimes people have meals together or have parties together, whatever it is. It can encourage cohesiveness in the group in terms of people caring about each other and caring about the success of the group altogether. Increasing the status and perceived difficulty of the group membership. Sometimes, if it's exclusive, if people think they better protect their position in this group that's exclusive and has some kind of superiority over other groups, that could increase pride and increase the feeling that people want to try to live up to the name that the group has as something that's exclusive and something that's superior. Stimulate competition with other groups, which we just discussed. Give rewards to the group. Before we discussed this idea to prevent social loafing by having people get individual rewards rather than just group. Well, here you can also give group rewards. Even when you're talking about school-age children, sometimes the group that does the best presentation all gets ice cream or all gets a soda. So those are a little easier than to give children incentives, or it's much cheaper than to give adults incentives. But either way, if the group does a good job and the group gets a good grade, the group is successful, the group gets a reward, encouraging teamwork. And to physically isolate the group, and there's only a limit to the extent that you can do that. Maybe give them their own conferences, their own meeting rooms, their own workspace, and that also encourages cohesiveness. Diversity, which in some sense could be a threat to cohesiveness, is still something that's important in a group because pretty much every group has it. This is the degree to which people are different from each other in a group. It could be cultural, that could be racial, gender. So diversity increases group conflict, but it also can help in the long run because it exposes everybody in the group to different views. First, the problem of diversity, and that is that this idea of fault lines, which are perceived divisions, are of subgroups. If you have a group of 9 people, and 3 of them are women and 2 of them are people of a different race, whatever it is, they could almost form into subgroups, and you don't want that. You want a little more cohesion than that. So you want people to bring their diversity of views, especially if it's something that requires creativity, like a marketing campaign or something. But you want everybody to try to work together for the good of the group altogether. So now we get to the idea of group decision making and really whether it's a good idea. Sometimes it's going to be a good idea, sometimes not. The general structure, the standard default structure is that the boss should make the decisions. Well, should you leave it up to a committee of a few people? The advantages of group decision making include more complete information and knowledge than can be attained by one person, diversity of views, and acceptance of a solution. If one person's making the decision, it's not likely to generate as much acceptance company-wide than if a committee of 9 people were unanimously made a decision. Of course, the weakness of group decision-making, which very often makes it impractical, the weaknesses on the right side over here is why most decisions in most companies are made by one person. It takes longer. There are conformity pressures, which discussed a little bit in the Ash experiment before. You could have 5 people because you want the diversity of their views, but if 4 of them think one way, it may not be that common for that 5th person to express disagreement. They might just want to go along. I think that's one of the things that the Ash experiment proved. Discussion can be dominated by 1 or a few members. You have to make sure to spread the team among people who are equally likely to contribute. And ambiguous responsibility. No one person feels that they have complete responsibility for the outcome, which could cause people to, pass the buck, be a little bit less creative, etc. Effectiveness and efficiency, of course, are also goals of any group and any work task in general. Effectiveness, we're comparing individuals to groups and small teams to big teams, or small groups to big groups. When you're talking about accuracy, the group is better than the average individual, but worse than the most accurate group member, which is an interesting idea that if somebody has to be right, somebody has to have the best idea. Now, you might not know who has the best idea right away. It may take years or the end of a campaign to figure out who actually had the best idea. But if you have 5 people, let's say, if you pick a random individual from those 5 people, so if you don't know if you don't know beforehand which one is the most effective, odds are you'll get the average would be that you'd get the 3rd most effective. You'd get the middle one. Generally speaking, whenever you choose anything, the greatest chance is to get something around the middle. Of course, you don't know which one you'll get, but the thing is, the overall, if you picked a person 1,000 times, the average would be the average of the person you'd pick, that the person would be in the middle of the group. So, if you have a group, then the diversity of views and the idea that the people with the better views will be more persuasive will help you get better views than the average individual. But theoretically, what you would really love to do is pick the best individual every time. So if you think you know how to pick the best individual, the individual's best is better than the group. But if you're not sure, it's better to pick the group. Speed, individuals are faster. Creativity, of course, groups are better because you've got that diversity of viewpoints. And degrees of acceptance by the other people in the organization, groups are of course better as well because you have multiple people rather than one person backing it up. And groups are less efficient for all the reasons that we've discussed earlier in this chapter. And finally, we come to two problems. We've discussed a whole bunch of problems already with groups, but we come to two problems to watch out for when it comes to group decision making, and that is groupthink and groupshift. Groupthink is the idea that people who are in the minority in terms of their views, people who disagree with most of the group, are less likely to express their opinion, thereby nullifying a little bit the advantage of creativity and advantage of diversity that groups have. And group shift is the way group members tend to exaggerate their initial positions when discussing alternatives and arriving at solutions. In other words, the idea of if somebody has a position in a group, let's say there are 5 different people with 5 different ideas, people want to double down on their own original suggestions and are not as likely to, unless they're persuaded by many members of the group, they kind of lock in their positions because they want to prove that they were right and they had the best initial thought. So let's first take a look at groupthink. Groupthink is deterioration of the individual's mental efficiency, reality testing, moral judgments even, as a result of group pressures. The Ash experiment dealt with the inability or unwillingness of people to disagree with the group even when they're right. And at the end of the chapter, I'm gonna put in the video about the Milgram experiment, which shows how people who are under pressure from a large group, people who are under pressure from authority, can actually give up even their moral views and do things that they would otherwise consider immoral based on the idea that other people are pressuring them to do it or because it's part of a system. Members rationalize away resistance to assumptions because they think that other people must be right, and even though they know deep down that they're right, they figure out a way to convince themselves. They pressure doubters to support the majority, interpret silence even as a yes vote. Another example here is the famous play called 12 Angry Men, where 11 jurors originally thought the person was guilty, and then one juror works to slowly convince the rest of the jury that the person is innocent. And one of the remarkable things about that play is how they avoid this groupthink, about how the person who's being pressured, doesn't give in, because the general rule will be is that people very often will give in if it's 11-1 on a jury. The rule generally with a jury is that you have to have 12 people agreeing. If you have 11-1 or 10-2, you get a hung jury, which means there's no decision. And you might think, well, how could you get 12 people to agree on anything? You probably have a lot of hung juries. The answer is you really don't have that many hung juries, and the reason is because you have 10 or 11 people agreeing to something. The 1 or 2 people who are holdouts tend to capitulate and tend to give in based on this concept of groupthink. So you do want to try to minimize groupthink. Now, you don't want people to be obstinate or stubborn, but you want to try to minimize it, because by having this groupthink, you're decreasing the creativity of the group. You're decreasing the ability of the group to think outside the box. Smaller groups, encouraging leaders to seek input from everybody. Appointed devil's advocate, that can be an interesting one. Appointing devil's advocate means have somebody argue against the group. Even if that person agrees with the group, have somebody forcefully argue against the group, and that way the people who don't agree with the group, or people who are convinced by it, will then be more favorably inclined to speak up. Another thing in the Ash experiment indicated was that people who do speak up, people who do have have like a supporter. You have 6 people in a group, people who think that the group is wrong are much more likely to say so if they have one other person that agrees with them. If it's 5-0, they'll capitulate right away most of the time, whereas if it's 4-1, the person, you have a teammate, they're more likely to keep arguing and try to do what that person thinks is best for the group overall together, and use exercises that stimulate active discussion and diverse alternatives to try to get people to speak up with their true opinions. In group shift, which which stems from the idea of really kind of the opposite of groupthink, where people want to stand out in a group. And that's the idea that group discussions lead members to assume more extreme positions just to kind of establish their, to kind of almost show off. I hate to put it that way, but to kind of just show off their ability to think through the situation. Groups often take positions of greater risk or greater caution based on the idea that people may take a position because they don't actually have to do it. It's one thing if you were the sole decision maker for a car manufacturer and you had to decide whether to start selling cars in a different continent, like Antarctica. Well, actually, that would be a pretty bad idea. And you had to decide whether to go to Australia and open a new market. Well, an individual might be very, very careful about that, whereas if there are 9 people in a group, you think, hey, you know what, I can always suggest it, and I can always take it back later on. And then you say, let's go to Australia. And they say, well, and then you argue for it because you've said it, and you're playing devil's advocate, and you're trying to do your best to convince other people almost as an intellectual exercise. And it allows people, I guess the idea is to be a little bit more reckless than they would in group discussion than if they had the individual, which could be a good thing and could be a bad thing, of course. In terms of group making decision techniques, how groups can make decisions, there are a few different options. There's interacting groups, which people meet and make decisions in the normal way. They meet face-to-face and rely on interactions to communicate. There's brainstorming. People kind of just sit around and figure out different ideas. You may have a brainstorming session where all the group members get together and throw out 30 ideas, and 28 of them end up in the trash can before the meeting is over, and that's fine. That's a good way to encourage creativity. And there's a nominal group technique, which just restricts discussion during the decision-making process to encourage independent thinking. You want to try to throw out ideas. It's kind of similar to brainstorming in that you don't shoot everybody's ideas down as they're saying them, because then people have the tendency to keep their mouth shut if they get a couple of ideas shut down. Shoot out a bunch of ideas, write them down, figure it out, and later on, you can dump the bad ones. Okay, then over here, this is kind of just a solution in terms of the type of group. The interacting is the people that work together just in normal traditional verbal cues, brainstorming, and then nominal, and you can see just some of their effectiveness and lack of effectiveness based on these various criteria that groups try to increase. Okay, at the end of the chapter, I'm going to put on the Milgram experiment, which I think will drive home a lot of the authoritative and groupthink issues that we discussed in this chapter. So enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next chapter.
In a unique period from the early 60s to the early 70s, a group of social scientists conducted a series of experiments examining the nature of human behavior and its relationship to social conventions and situations.
In this setting, I allow things to be done to me that I wouldn't allow in any other context. The dentist is about to put an electric drill into my mouth. In this setting, I willingly expose my throat to a man with a razor blade.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience? These are questions.
But he might be dead in there. The experiment requires that you continue teaching. 330 volts.
The experiments that Milgram and others conducted were controversial, and for ethical reasons may never be conducted again. Yet the results of those experiments remain groundbreaking, profoundly revealing about the tensions between the individual and society, and increasingly relevant to contemporary life. In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an event that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable. how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven.
Mm-hmm.
And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know. Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most, subjects found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically, inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. Quit. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
Next was slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the chalkboard.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think, very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows like how far human beings will go to appease what they perceive to be an authority figure.
Milgram has identified one of the constants, one of the universals of social behavior. The readiness to obey authority cuts across time. It's a constant. The other outstanding and distinctive thing about the obedience experiment is how much it has and keeps on permeating contemporary culture and thought. It's still with us in very, very important ways.